They say the internet forgets nothing, but it hides plenty. Grand Rapids Diner is an internet legend sprawling from X, the paranormal board of 4chan, one of the easiest boards to troll. It all began on August 20th, 2019 at about 1 a.m. when the original poster would upload an image of an abandoned building with a light on, which was partially hidden by garbage bags which covered the windows. Anon would give the background of the property, in which he claimed there used to be a popular restaurant housed there called Isaac's, which operated in the mid-90s, however, had shut down in the early 2010s, and then the building was sold in 2014 to a, quote, strange couple in their 40s who planned to convert it into a coffee shop. They first painted the exterior and then put up a lamp inside and taped garbage bags over the windows, where it would remain that way for years. The anonymous poster would claim that through the fall of 2015, he had seen multiple SUVs pulling into the establishment, often with groups of young children, and when the adults would leave the building, these children remained, and allegedly this had happened multiple times over the years. But now the original poster in August 2019 claimed to have been passing by when he seen a boy about 10 years old pull down the garbage bag from the window from inside the building and began banging on the glass, prompting Anon to try and take a picture, but the kid was quickly yanked out of sight. He called the police, who came out, shined flashlights through the windows, saw nothing, and quickly left. And to prove he wasn't lying, he would post a timestamp photo confirming he was really there. Of course, the thread became full of speculation, which suggested the building was a cover for, you guessed it, trafficking, although some just straight up said that the poster was LARPing. But it was too late for the majority of the lurkers, because now they were speculating about hidden tunnels that went into the building and cover-ups by local authorities. Everyone on X was now interested in this thread, and it would soon spiral out of control, as multiple posters in the thread claimed to live nearby and went to check out the property for themselves. Since the original poster put the address up, that's when a strange message was posted to the thread that read, "We see you outside of our establishment, and we see you taking pictures. What happens next is up to you. Continue to press this, and the outcome will not be a pleasant one for you or your family." Now who knows if any of these posters were actually there, and if the threat posted actually came from inside the building. What is known is a second poster did actually arrive after a 45-minute drive, and we know this because he took pictures of the building with a timestamp to prove it. Apparently, he had planned to go inside and take a picture, but when he got there, he seen people moving around inside. He stated he was going to go somewhere and get a bite to eat and come back to check and see if the building was empty. Now the thread was getting a ton of attention from all of 4chan. However, this poster never returned and was soon labeled the Kazoo Anon disappearance, Kazoo being Kalamazoo, where he had driven from. Apparently too, the photos of this place, which had been uploaded into the thread, began to get removed, although other posters had already saved the images and just reposted them. By early the next morning, the thread was still going, and the original poster, as well as the Kazoo Anon, were still silent. However, someone claiming to be the original poster wrote he made the entire thing up because he was bored, but no one believed him, and it was at this point more people in the thread started making plans to go to the site themselves. One of these would even do it on a Twitch stream. His name was Trezulius, and he would post another picture from outside, and he claimed he tried streaming it to Twitch and YouTube, but both broadcasts were ended immediately. But it was just 2 minutes after he posted this photo confirming he was there that he would post again claiming someone had came out of the building and he took off running, and he never posted again either. However, by 7 a.m., a new streamer, Bushmatic, showed up on site, and he began broadcasting live from the scene. And he found nothing really, just some old woman who left around 8 a.m., and Bushmatic noted seeing an oil lamp inside. By this point, the thread essentially fell into LARP territory and really lost a lot of credibility. Many concluded the entire thread was nothing but a troll post, with many Anons working each other up into a frenzy. However, the building's owner was eventually tracked to a company called Humanix LLC, and that part would be a bit strange. See, Humanix LLC was traced to a man living in Kalamazoo named Ray Tabachka, who was just a normal IT guy. The thing was, though, nothing on Ray's LinkedIn profile mentioned Humanix. Actually, there were no connections at all other than the registry listing, suggesting the name was used without his consent, or Humanix was essentially a shell company set up for tax purposes or asset protection. There were other issues too, because the registry page for the company would 404 when you would try to click the link. Likewise, any attempt to find out more information had limited results. In addition, the website listed 2 different headquarters addresses. One was the strange building the thread was focused on, and another address was located at a remote mansion in the woods of Rockford, Michigan, suggesting the data was outdated or possibly deliberately made confusing, which is even stranger by the fact that the original poster in Google Maps confirmed the building had basically been unchanged for 4 years in spite of the fact that it was supposedly under renovation. The company, too, supposedly only had 2 employees. Was one of these the old woman seen on the stream? And now, on to theories. Is it any surprise that the top one is still the whole thing was a LARP? I mean, this is 4chan and X, and there has never been any verifiable follow-up. Plus, with the dramatic claims and disappearing photos, which could be deleted by the posters themselves, it seems likely. And while some Anons did go there to check it out, with at least one verified streamer, it didn't really prove anything. Second most likely theory is it was just a failed small business. In fact, with the long, slow renovations, taped windows, and persistent lamp, it seems like someone was working hard to make it succeed and never could. Captain Kutchie Key Lime Pie. This is another internet mystery that got its start back in October of 2009 when someone began posting odd comments over numerous blogs and news articles about a restaurant which was no longer opened called Kutchie's Key West Cafe, and their most prized dish, their key lime pies. Interestingly, the comments didn't always appear under food articles. Sometimes it was travel, politics, and oftentimes sex. The comments would often ramble and were full of pop culture references from the time period. This went on for well over a decade, with this person leaving over 700 comments under at least 35 different handles, like Jake Carson, Willie Jord, and Roger Ramjet. To make things even crazier, each alias had its different style of posting. Jake Carson was more of an upbeat promotional blurb, while Willie Jordan usually posted sexually suggestive replies that somehow he would tie back to Key Lime Pie, while Roger Ramjet dropped in random jokes ending in lines like, quote, "And don't forget the Key Lime Pie." Now for the record, this restaurant did exist. It actually opened in Nashville, North Carolina in 1978. It was owned by Oswald, or Kutchie, Pelez Jr., and his wife, Anita. But it closed around 2005, and if you're keeping track of the timeline, yep, it closed a whole 4 years before this person went on his comment campaign about it online. A deeper look into the comments revealed that although sometimes the posts were coherent, other times it was just a jumble of nostalgic celebrity shoutouts to Johnny Carson, Don Rickles, or even Steve Martin. It was also noticed between 2009 and 2013, each comment was unique, but after 2013, it all just became copy-pasted comments, suggesting that the poster had built up a personal library of phrases he could use. Even stranger, he would sometimes visit comment sections years after he posted originally, and added new comments, sometimes under the same name, sometimes under one of the other handles. Now here's where it starts to get a little bit stranger. By 2016, 7 years after this person had been posting, Reddit discovered the weird mystery and began discussing it. Finally, the Key Lime poster stopped his copy pasting and left obscure phrases like, "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" After this, Key Lime poster slacked off big time, with just 6 comments over 2017 and 18, and then he completely disappeared, with the final message reading, quote, "Captain Kutchie's award-winning cheeseburgers in paradise," and "the world's greatest key lime pies." That's the mystery. Who was doing this, and why? Well, the most likely theory is it was just some obsessed person that had a connection to the restaurant, most likely a customer who is fixated on a period in their past, which somehow relates to that restaurant. It might not even be a customer, maybe it was an employee, but whoever it was certainly looked back at that time with nostalgia glasses, although that doesn't explain the creation of dozens of accounts, which brings up the next thought that it was someone with some kind of mental illness. It explains the repetitive fixation and era-locked memories, as well as the emotional intensity. There's even some online sleuths that have looked at this mystery that claim to have went to that restaurant all those years ago and seen an odd customer that would hang out there that was fixated on pies. Of course, that could have just been a troll adding to the story. Finally, maybe this person was trolling all along, trying to create an internet mystery himself. Sewer Boy shaking the bed. This one comes from a now deleted post by users on the subreddit called Experiencers, which is essentially a place where people can discuss their transrational experiences without the fear of being ridiculed. But what exactly is a transrational experience? They're sort of related to unexplained phenomena. It's more accurately described as experiences that go beyond or transcend reason, things that cannot be fully explained by logic or science alone. This can include dreams, moments of profound intuition, or the feeling of being connected to something larger than oneself. It can be things like astrology, tarot cards, or even prayer. And in this particular thread, we have the poster called Service Large, who brought up an experience from his college days in 2012. He noted that it was a time when he was really into music and was actually in a band himself. His favorite genre was the 60s and 70s, in particular, the band Led Zeppelin. In studying the bands from that era, he looked to see what it was that inspired their creativity, and of course he realized it was drugs. And before long, he began taking that same route. He would use acid, take shrooms, and smoke marijuana. It helped him to think differently, and he began focusing on the Led Zeppelin symbols themselves, which were allegedly connected to Aleister Crowley. He would also look into the guitarist, Jimmy Page, who was said to be connected to other occult practices. Now, Service Large didn't take a lot of this seriously, but that would soon change. Before long, he had moved into an off-campus apartment with a friend. Being college kids, they had to take a cheap one, and this one in particular was pretty creepy on the outside, and it was actually a third-floor attic. And a short while after moving in, he began to have strange experiences, like the night he fell asleep, only to be awoken at the feeling of someone gently shaking his bed. He felt a sense of dread and anxiety, so he got up to turn the lights on, and of course, the bed was no longer moving. He assumed that it was due to the house being so old. He was really just hearing the creaking of the wood, is what he would tell himself. He eventually calmed down and relaxed, and started nodding off, and then the bed started shaking again, and it would happen every time that he almost dozed off. He did eventually fall asleep, but this was only the beginning, because it continued to happen occasionally before it moved on to happening every night. Since his sleep was beginning to suffer, he got up and attempted to sleep on the couch, thinking that the old bed was just unstable. From here, though, it would continue. Now the couch was shaking every night, and it drove him crazy. One morning he would ask his roommate about it, and he stated that he himself had never experienced anything strange in the apartment. Things only got worse from here. Due to the lack of sleep, he started to get bad grades, and his day-to-day life took a serious impact. He resorted to using alcohol or sleep meds just so he could get a little rest every night. But still, oftentimes, his bed would begin to shake and awaken him. He soon sought psychiatric counseling, but that didn't help either. And after a month of this, it intensified. Just about the time that Service Large began to suspect that he was losing his mind, a friend of his roommates came over to hang out, and the two of them were on the couch drinking. When this friend looked at him and stated, "What's shaking the couch?" Finally, Service Large had relief, knowing it wasn't just him that had been feeling this. That didn't stop the strangeness though, because one of the worst nights he recalled came after this, and it was when he was asleep, and he awoke to see the bed physically moving with him in it. That shook him up so bad that he called his mom, who was a devout Catholic, and told him to pray as she did, and things would die down a little bit. But it's here where it would all culminate. As he began to suspect the place was haunted, he started making arrangements to move out, and that might be what led to the worst night. As he fell asleep, he had the most vivid dream in his life. It started with him playing street hockey with some of his friends back in the neighborhood where he had grown up. Suddenly, they lost a ball into a sewer grate, and he went down to get it. When he began to hear a small boy crying, he would go tell his mother, who called the police, and they got him out. And the dream took a strange turn when his mother decided to adopt this little boy, and he lived with them. But he was a bad kid, constantly breaking things and misbehaving, and he even tried to kill the family dog, which of course led to the parents trying to get him out of the home. And he remembered next, they were standing in the courtroom for family issues, and he had to get up and tell the lawyer why he thought the boy was bad. The lawyer asked, "Do you know this boy?" Service Large 4601 replied, "No." He said, "Are you sure you don't know him?" He stared at the boy again and said, "No, I never met him until the day we found him." Finally, the boy looked directly into his eyes and said, "You know exactly who I am. I'm the one who's been shaking your bed every night." This caused Service Large to wake up to the pure terror of the bed shaking. He wasted no time and quickly moved out, and it all stopped. The bed shaking, the bad dreams, all of it. However, here is the catch. It was about a year later when he started dating a girl that actually lived on the first floor of that home. He began telling her and her roommate about everything that had happened when he lived there, and that's when the roommate told him there had been a fire there about 5 years earlier, and an 18-year-old kid had ran into the building trying to get everyone out and died of smoke inhalation on the 3rd floor. She even showed him the news article and everything. Service Large wrapped up the post by asking what the consensus was on the story. Had his dabbling in the dark arts opened up a connection to this tragic event? So, I guess that means it's theory time for us. The most obvious one is sleep-related hallucinations, which are amplified by substance abuse. It's very common and can seem very realistic if you're very sleep-deprived, anxious, or on psychedelics, alcohol, or sleep meds. And since it always happened when he was falling asleep and waking up, it makes perfect sense. It even stopped when lights came on, and more than likely, that vivid dream of the sewer boy was caused by his waking up often during the sleep. Of course, the problem is that the friend said he could also feel the couch shaking. Another possible scenario is that the bed really was shaking from the house settling or some kind of mechanical issue, like HVAC running, trains nearby, or trucks. It could even be a loose bed frame. This seems even more likely considering it all stopped after he moved out. Not to mention, the 3rd floor is more susceptible to structure movement. Or hey, maybe this really was a paranormal experience. Or should I say, transrational. Clothes-Slashing Poltergeist of Wooster. June 1869, Millersburg, Ohio. A family known as the Hoffmans would become one more family that would go down in the books of poltergeist history. It all began innocently enough when Mr. Hoffman would lose $2 from his purse. At first, he didn't think much of it, chalking it up to just misplacing the money, and he made a note to himself that in the future, put the money in a location he would be sure to remember. However, it did not matter where he put his money, it always vanished, and before long, he found it impossible to keep any funds in the home at all. But it wasn't just money. Soon, other things began to disappear in the same exact way, but it was simple items, like food and clothing. But then it got worse, as cookware began to fall from shelves and was often smashed to pieces, while stones, eggs, and other small objects were constantly thrown around the house. Sometimes, tiny bits of gravel and sand would be playfully thrown at the house's inhabitants. Obviously, this was very frustrating to the family, and after trying every conceivable way in the world to track down the source of these pranks, they just gave up and moved to a new home. This time, they would end up moving to Wooster, about 20 miles away. Soon, Mr. Hoffman would take a job at the local mill, and he was allowed to live there temporarily. His wife and kids, who were 20, 17, and 15, would move into a room for rent in town. It was a difficult adjustment, but much better than the harassment they hoped to get away from. And luckily for Mr. Hoffman, he did get away from it. But Mrs. Hoffman and her kids, well, they didn't fare as well. Actually, Mrs. Hoffman and their daughters seemed to be the main targets. Soon, their clothing began to disappear and reappear in pieces. They had been cut, slashed, and torn to shreds. Sometimes the garments were found stuffed into strange places. Family linens were also discovered packed in the mouth of the cellar drain, while a silk dress turned up under a pile of firewood. Other skirts and garments were also dug up after being placed into the dirt or sand. It seemed like someone, or something, was deliberately destroying their belongings. This would be followed by notes, which would randomly appear around the home. Sometimes, it appeared like they were tossed up from the cellar, and on these notes were threats and sometimes odd instructions, like Mrs. Hoffman was told that if she went down the cellar stairs backwards, on her knees, and at a certain time, she would find a box containing $2,000. She wanted to try it, but her neighbors, smelling a trap, talked her out of it. There was also another letter that arrived stating that only she, not her husband, could retrieve the money. Things began to take a dark turn after this. Loud pounding echoed through the walls at night, and stones, from the size of pebbles to the size of a man's fist, were thrown through doors and windows. Dishes rattled as well, and some were broken. And there were also witnesses to this that were outside the family, like neighbors and friends. One young man that was visiting mocked the whole charade and was immediately hit in the head with a red-hot stone. When he grabbed for his handkerchief, it was shredded to ribbons. After weeks of this, the Hoffmans had hardly anything left. All their dishes were broken, clothes had been destroyed, and everything else was missing. The news spread, and all kinds of investigators showed up, from ministers and inspectors to spiritualists, but no one could find a cause, although of course, everyone suspected a human prankster, but one was never caught. After this, the family moved again, this time from Wooster to Akron. Mr. and Mrs. Hoffman, however, never lived together again. She took an apartment with their son, while Mr. Hoffman would board at a room nearby. They never divorced, but they never actually functioned as a real couple again. This has went down as one of the more stranger poltergeist encounters, largely because of the clothes slashing. Today, theories vary, but the one speculated about most is that Mrs. Hoffman was behind the whole thing. In fact, Mr. Hoffman was basically left unscathed after they moved to Wooster. The majority of stories stress that Mrs. Hoffman had begged him to move to Wooster to allegedly protect them, and to get money she believed was in a basement, which again goes back to the story about her being tossed up a note that said if she went down the stairs backwards on her knees, she would get that money. In short, it seems very possible that Mrs. Hoffman was battling some real mental illness at the time of this that was just never properly addressed. Hey y'all, it's that time again. It's the Small Mystery Roundup, where we look at the mysteries where there's not a lot of data, or they're just kind of boring. First, the original Gurgles and Bugman image source. Gurgles and Bugman is a pretty popular creepypasta that began circulating around 2012, but that is not the focus of this mystery. Instead, it was the accompanying image that came with it, as you can see here. Apparently, no one knows where this came from, and this is a time well before AI, so it wasn't created with a generator. The image, which shows a doll-like face with pale skin, dark hair, and an open mouth dripping black fluid, can be traced back at least 5 years prior to the creepypasta, in a thread on eBaum's World, with the specific date of October 12, 2007, with the file name dothing.uo6.jpg, suggesting that it was not created by that poster, and instead was just shared, meaning it had been circulating even earlier than that. To this day, there's no clear answer on its origin. Giant scale jellyfish, Leaksville. This one comes from a UFO blog called Lights in the Texas Sky, where it obviously takes in UFO reports from Texas and the South in general, and it records an incident from Lakesville, Mississippi on March 16, 2003, when a teacher walked outside and was stargazing as she looked to the northeast and seen a huge jellyfish or squid object in the sky. She immediately knew that the object, which had 8 to 10 tentacles, was not man-made. The tentacles had lights going up and down on them, and they waved back and forth. She estimated that it was about 5 to 10 miles up in the sky. She would run in and get her friend, who also came out to look, and they observed a smaller craft flying in and out of the largest part. They would actually call the police and report it, but they were essentially laughed at. The jellyfish made no more maneuvers. It just kind of waved back and forth and sailed off into the distance right before the sun came out. Keel's Secret Dinosaur Forest, Massachusetts. John Keel is a famous name in the world of paranormal research, and he's widely known for writing the Mothman prophecies, but he actually wrote about many cases of unexplained phenomena. In particular, many articles for Fate magazine. That's where this next one pops up, and he provides very little info. According to Keel, there is a forest in Massachusetts where people have been seeing dinosaurs. The huge creatures apparently get spotted occasionally before vanishing into the forest, where they cannot be found, leading Keel to suggest there could be some kind of time warp located there. Unfortunately, he didn't leave much more than that, leaving the dinosaur forest of Massachusetts as a sweet memory. Disappearing hallway. Next, we go to our favorite archived website, UFOfreeparanormal.com. And man, I really wish someone would buy this domain and relaunch it. Anyways, if you're not familiar, the site had a section of user-submitted stories where visitors could send in an email of their account, which was then posted to the web page. In this account, we got a story from a user of the site detailing her friend's account, who she listed under a fake name, Sarah. Now, Sarah, as a child, stayed in various hotels with her mother due to her mother's job, where she worked the night shift and got off at 3 or 4 in the morning. And it was on one of these late nights that Sarah was wandering around the hotel exploring when she came across an unusual spiral staircase. It closed by walls instead of railings. While going up, she bumped into a wall panel that moved, and she fell into a dark hidden hallway. Luckily, the little girl would often carry a flashlight around the hotel, so she was able to use it to try and find her way out. And after about 10 minutes, she found a door, or panel, with light around it. As she pushed it open, and it led to the hotel's pool area. The staff seen her and ran over. They shut the door quickly and told her to never speak about what she had seen. Since they knew her though, they took her back to her mom's work area, and then the employees disappeared. Sarah would tell her mom the strange account, and they went back to the stairs to check, and there was no such movable panel in the wall, and hotel management and staff denied knowing anything about a secret hallway. She would later find out that the pool had actually been closed and chained off for over a year, making the whole story that much stranger. Encephalitis lethargica epidemic. This was an epidemic that is largely forgotten about and not really discussed much today, mainly because of the time it occurred, 1916 to 1930, which overlapped a time when another pandemic you may have heard of was occurring, the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920, which killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people. Encephalitis lethargica epidemic, or more commonly known as sleeping sickness, killed about 500,000 people over a much longer period of time, so it was much less deadly, but still more mysterious. Sleeping sickness was a neurological disorder that caused inflammation of the brain, leading to extreme sleepiness or lethargy, as well as movement disorders like tremors. Then there was psychiatric changes like psychosis, and in severe cases, coma or death. Patients would often appear to be frozen between sleep and wakefulness, like they were awake but unable to move, barely responding. It began during World War I, another reason it was overshadowed, as the cases first popped up in Austria and France. It didn't hit its peak until 1919 to 1926, when it would hit millions of people. About 1/3 of them would die, and another third of the survivors would develop Parkinson's-like syndrome, while there were even more survivors that were left in a complete frozen statue-like state for decades, fully conscious but completely immobile, only finding some relief in the 1960s when a neurologist, Dr. Oliver Sacks, created a Parkinson's drug that briefly awoke the patients after decades, which would be the story of the 1990 film called Awakenings. To this day though, no one knows where it came from or how it developed. There's some suggestions that it may have been linked to the 1918 Spanish flu, but how they were related is unclear. It could have also been an autoimmune response triggered by an infection, maybe from streptococcal bacteria. In either case, it disappeared in the 30s, although there have been rare times that similar infections have appeared, and when it does happen, it's studied closely, as researchers are still trying to figure out what caused sleeping sickness. Zodiac Killer was protected by authorities. This is a conspiracy theory which suggests that the authorities have known for a very long time the identity of one of the most infamous uncaptured serial killers ever, that of the Zodiac. It comes from a 2012 book called The Zodiac Killer Cover-Up: The Silenced Badge, written by former officer Lyndon E. Lafferty. Lafferty claimed that he was sitting in his patrol car at a rest area in 1970 when a man looking just like the Zodiac sketch parked right next to him. After the man left, he jotted down his license plate number, and soon the investigation began because Lafferty would research this man up until the book's release in 2012. But it wasn't just him. By the 1980s, a team of independent investigators, including retired officers and an ex-Navy intelligence officer, would help Lafferty with his investigation. In total, they found 156 circumstantial factors of evidence. Now, he wouldn't name the man obviously for fear of a lawsuit, but gave him a pseudonym, Tucker. Now, we obviously can't go over all of these, but we'll look at a couple. This Tucker apparently frequented a restaurant where one of the victims worked, Darlene Farron, and one witness gave a description of a car lurking outside Darlene's house, and that car was similar to Tucker's. Darlene's sister was also shown a picture of this man in 1987, and immediately identified him as the man stalking her sister when she worked as a waitress at a restaurant. Lafferty also claimed that the infamous cipher letters by the Zodiac spells out his own name. There's also many other little things, like him being in proximity to victims or crime scenes, as well as being in those areas around the time of the murders. In some cases, he had personal connections to the victim. So what was the motive and why the cover-up? According to Lafferty, Tucker was mad at the world after finding out that his wife was having affairs, and he wanted revenge. In particular, there was one of these affairs that led to the cover-up, a county superior court judge, who obviously didn't want the news of his own affair coming out, so he ordered law enforcement to stop investigating. Hyannis Sea Monster, 1897. September 1897, Hyannis, Massachusetts, would play home to this next obscure cryptid mystery, when the town's residents passing the shore would notice a strange and giant creature that had washed ashore from the ocean and into the mouth of a local creek. Hundreds of people were soon on site to look at and study the creature, yet no one could identify it. Soon a man named Theodore A. Drew, who was sort of a jack-of-all-trades inside town, would collect the skeleton, but first, he would take notes. He stated that it was a reptile, one that had never been seen on land or sea. It was grayish on its back, gradually shading to white on the sides and stomach. It was measured at 8 feet in length, although only 2.5 feet of that was body. Another 3 feet of that was neck and head, while the tail was 2.5 feet. The body was duck-shaped, and the thickest part was about 1 foot in diameter. Its long neck looked like that of a big snake, about 6 inches in thickness, while its head was long and flat, and about 8 inches across at its widest point. The tail was the weirdest part. It ended in a fleshly-like paddle, nearly 1 foot long and 6 inches across. The body had 4 flippers shaped like paddles of a seal, while the rear flippers were covered in a coarse hairy fringe. The lower jaw was missing, but the upper jaw showed no signs of teeth, meaning it was possible that this was a young creature. Before the skin was stripped off, it was found that the breastbone was shaped like a duck's. There were no scales. Instead, it was smooth like an eel. It was also discovered that the animal most likely swam near the surface, so it could poke its head out to breathe air. This is another one of those where the scholars at the time believed it was a plesiosaur, which were supposed to have went extinct millions of years ago. Alright guys, that's all of the Small Mystery Roundup. Before we get back to it though, I'd like to remind you, if you enjoy the content and would like to support the channel, please check the description below for links to the Patreon, YouTube membership, and Buy Me a Coffee. For now, let's jump back to the video. The Butter Boggart, 1854, Lowestoft, Ernston, England. A very strange tale would begin to play out. It happened at the home of a family known as the Warburtons, which consisted of a weaver, 61-year-old Samuel, his wife Anne, 66 years old, along with Samuel's brother, William, 55 years old, and finally, Anne's great niece, 12-year-old Mary Hopwood. The family was described as being very devout primitive Methodist and quiet, but it's on January 22nd of that year that the family began to notice something very peculiar. It seems small lumps of butter, that's right, butter, started appearing randomly throughout the house. It was on the floors, furniture, walls, bedding, clothing, and even between the pages of their Bible. It ranged in size, sometimes about the size of a bean, but other times as big as a walnut. Interestingly, it never appeared on their skin, although it was found in places like the inside of garments and beneath quilts. This was all very curious to say the least, and it went on for a period of several days. Samuel would get so desperate that he hung up boughs of holly from the ceiling in an attempt to ward off witchcraft, and when he did, butter started to appear on it, leading to the family tossing it in the fire and watching the butter melt like one would expect it would do. The news spread quickly, and before long, visitors from nearby would make the journey to witness the events. It's here that we would get quite a few witnesses to the whole bizarre saga. One was a local constable, the other a local farmer, while finally a reporter from the local newspaper came to check it out. In all accounts, they confirmed to have witnessed it, and confirmed it was indeed butter, although no one had a theory as to where it was coming from. However, as mentioned, it stopped after a few days, which many seemed to try and connect to the visit of a local primitive Methodist preacher. And that pretty much brings us to the theories. Of course, at the time, a lot of the locals of this small rural area were pretty superstitious, and they believed it was witchcraft, or more specifically, a boggart, which is a shape-shifting creature from folklore and, more famously now, Harry Potter. Their primary ability is to transform into the personification of someone's deepest fear. They also hide in the dark, especially in the cupboards or shadowy corners of a home. They are often described as acting sort of like poltergeist, which would explain the butter prank. Of course, the most likely real theory was it was a hoax, considering it was always found in places someone could access pretty easily. Not to mention, reporters did note that some of the lumps looked, quote, as if sucked and ejected, suggesting someone was hiding the butter in their mouth and then spitting it into the location, which is pretty gross. But who would do this? Well, maybe the young Mary Hopwood, who was just wanting attention. Of course, the suspected hoaxer at the time was Samuel's brother William. Other theories suggested later on that Samuel had some kind of mental illness, described back then as a, quote, mental alienation, and he may not have been aware that he was even doing it. Regardless of which one, this only happened a few days in early 1854, and no other weird cases of unexplained phenomena occurred in the home. Buckingham Undead Nuisance. You may not be familiar with the name, William of Newburgh, but you no doubt are familiar with his work, History of English Affairs, covering the years of 1066 to 1198 when William died. And why do I say that you are familiar with him? One simple reason. It's his work that we know about the famous story, Green Children of Woolpit. Yep, we have discussed it here before. It's a pretty well-known account, and we have William to thank for recording it. But did you know that William has also left us with another equally, if not more bizarre account? It comes from 1196, when William began to hear that there were a number of dead people, seemingly rising from their graves. These rumors began to amplify, and William began to look through records to see if he could find any similar accounts from the past, but couldn't, so he decided to investigate further. In total, he would find 4 accounts that he felt were worth sharing, and I should emphasize here, it's his reputation as a chronicler and historian that grants these weird stories any credibility at all. But although he found 4 accounts he deemed from reliable sources, we're only going to discuss one. It starts with a man that died in Buckingham, and his wife began making arrangements for him to be laid to rest on the evening of the Lord's Ascension, which is 40 days after Easter. The following night, his wife would lay down to sleep, and she was awoken to see that her husband was now laying on the bed beside her, which obviously horrified her. The story does record too that he apparently almost crushed her by laying on top of her, so I'm not sure exactly what it was he was trying to do. In any case, the accounts do not record what happened next, but The following night, he returned again, and just like the night before, he assaults her in the same manner. By the third day, she went to get help from some companions who stayed up and waited on the dead man to return. When he did, they successfully drove him away. After this, he gave up on harassing his wife and instead targeted his brothers who lived down the same street, and he apparently harassed them in the same way. They would round up some friends to drive him off though, and the dead man was so mad that he assaulted their animals as a way to punish them for pushing him away, I suppose. Soon, everyone on the street was scared of the dead man coming to visit them, so they kept an eye out after dark, and it ceased. However, that's because he was now brave enough to come out at daytime and assault people. This is where it would get truly strange, because apparently these people, who would now travel together in groups, would also be assaulted. But it was only certain people that could actually see the dead man, and not all of them were touched. Some were not even aware of his presence. Finally, residents were upset enough that they went to the council of the church and sought out an Archdeacon Stephen, and it's this man who would personally tell William the story. Stephen would also write the Bishop of London asking for advice on the situation. This bishop, upon researching the issue, found that this had happened in England before, and the locals told him they typically would dig up the body and burn it. The bishop, however, did not want to do that, and instead wrote a letter of absolution forgiving the dead man of any unstated sins, and he sent it with the archdeacon, who opened the tomb, checked the body, and resealed it with the letter placed upon the corpse. After this, the dead man never rose again. It's also worth pointing out, these nighttime sightings were always of a more physical zombie-type body, while the daytime sightings were more like a ghost or poltergeist. But what do we make of it? More than likely, it was just mass hysteria in a small community. Maybe his wife was struggling to sleep alone, and she got sleep paralysis or grief-related hallucinations, and she told the story to neighbors who worked themselves up into a frenzy. Although, it's just as possible it was a deliberate hoax to try and scare the neighbors, and the story somehow got told as the truth to William. Arigo. We have all seen the famous faith healer, who many call a grifter, Benny Hinn, whose act on stage has been going on now for over 4 decades. You might see him often touching people who then fall to the ground miraculously healed. However, as you might imagine, he's often believed to be nothing more than a con man. But what if there was a faith healer who, not very famous, did seem to really have some kind of gift that allowed him to heal? That brings us to Jose Pedro de Freitas, or better known by his nickname, Arigo, meaning country bumpkin. He was born on a farm in Brazil in 1918, and as a child, he began to have visions of bright light and would hear voices talking in a strange language. Arigo, unlike his other brothers, did not go to college. In fact, he dropped out of school and worked on the family farm until he eventually took a job in the mines in his 20s. But it was by his early 30s things would get strange. He began having recurring dreams of a doctor with a German accent, who he later identified as a deceased Dr. Adolfo Fritz. Fritz would apparently tell him he had chosen him to work as a medium to continue his work as a healer. This terrified Arigo, and he went to get advice from his real doctor, and even spoke to a priest who would warn him to stay away from spiritualism. However, it was too late, because soon, Arigo began feeling like he should give in to Dr. Fritz's orders, and one day, upon running into a friend who walked on crutches, Arigo yelled, "It's about time you got rid of them." He then snatched the crutches away and told his friend to walk, which he was able to do. These verbal commands proved effective for others, but it was in 1950, when he was working in the election campaign for a senator, that he would become famous. Lucio Bittencourt was suffering from cancer, and one night, when he was unable to sleep, Arigo came into the room holding a razor and clearly in a trance. He spoke in a German accent, telling him the operation had to be done. Bittencourt lost consciousness, but when he awoke in the morning, he found his shirt had been cut and bloodstained, with a neat incision on the back. Strangely, the next day Bittencourt went to see his doctor for a planned examination, and it was here the doctor told Bittencourt the tumor had been removed by a surgical technique never seen before in Brazil. The senator would talk openly about his miraculous recovery, and before long, Arigo was working a full-time schedule as a faith healer. although he declined all payments or any favors for the healings. The trance-like state he would go into was not like Edgar Casey's dream state. Instead, Arigo turned into a whole different personality. He held his head higher and spoke with a German accent. His diagnosis was instantaneous. He didn't even look at the patient's records or ask questions. He would then write out a prescription at an incredible speed. Sometimes the medicines were obsolete or had not even reached Brazil yet. Sometimes he would carry out rudimentary surgery, like taking a paring knife and removing a cyst. Sometimes the patient would even be standing against the wall. The operation would be performed in minutes using an unsterilized knife or scalpel, and the patient would get up and leave with no pain, even though there had been no anesthesia, antisepsis, or stitches used. The incisions closed themselves, or sometimes Arigo stopped the bleeding by prayer. And of course, when he would snap out of it, he could remember nothing that had happened. Interestingly, there were some patients he turned away, telling them they could see a regular doctor that could help, while telling others there was nothing else that could be done. He was also, for some reason, unable to treat himself or relatives. Over his career, he allegedly met and treated at least 1 million people, many of them famous. Brazilian doctors began researching him in the 50s, and noted on one occasion he brought a patient with inoperable ovarian cancer, and following his treatment, completely recovered and even had a child. There was even a woman with cancerous growths on her abdomen who was given 2 months to live by her doctor, but after 3 prescriptions by Arigo, she completely recovered and lived a normal life. He would also be tested by another doctor who had gained fame for exposing faith healers, but after seeing him perform 4 operations, including the removal of a liver tumor, he stated there definitely needed to be more research done cause he had no idea how he was doing it. Despite making no money from this, he would eventually be arrested and charged with witchcraft and practicing medicine without a license. He was sentenced to over a year in prison, and interestingly, patients would still come to the jail to see him while the guards turned a blind eye. Now there was a lot more research done during his life and in the years after, and some strange things have been found, like in 545 cases in which records were kept, it was discovered 95% of these, Arigo's diagnosis matched the conventional doctor's diagnosis. However, as you might have already figured out, skeptics dismiss many of the claims and state that he was carefully using sleight of hand for most of these so-called psychic surgeries. And as far as his medicine, their healing was chalked up to as placebo effect. There was also a study that came out in 1973, just 2 years after he died, and in this study, 836 patients were tracked down and asked about their treatment. About 16% of them claimed that there had been improvement, while 56% claimed there had been no changes at all, while the others just didn't respond. It's also worth noting that Dr. Adolfo Fritz that came to Arigo in his dreams didn't even exist. Susie's dying. During the 1970s and 80s in the United Kingdom, a peculiar set of rumors began to swirl. These rumors stated that if you went to a public phone box and dialed a specific number, you would hear a woman's strangely monotone voice saying repeatedly, "Help me, help me, Susie's dying," over and over again, as if it was a recording playing back at you. The exact number varied depending on who told the story, but the most common version was 20202020. This mystery spanned decades, and even now, people still wonder what the truth was. Did this number and message actually exist? And if so, why? The first detailed account that really brought attention to the mystery appeared in 2000 from a man named Rob Dickinson, who stated the following, quote, "Back around 1975, when I was 9, some of the kids I knocked around with insisted we all pile into the nearest phone box to hear a spooky message by dialing a number. I think it was made up of zeros, twos, and ones. Without needing to insert 2 pence, a woman speaking in a curiously monotone voice would be heard saying, 'Help me, Susie's dying,' over and over. Some of the lads said she sometimes said, 'Help me, Susie's drowning,' always in the same slow, seemingly bored tone of voice. Was it some weird engineer's test signal? Hence, no money needed?" End quote. The other accounts would later verify Rob's story, and from here, we know that the phone box is around the town of Burnley, up north in Lancashire. where the calls were supposedly made. These 4 accounts make up the most detailed versions of this weird mystery. They originated from a book entitled It Happened to Me, Real Life Tales of Paranormal Volume 1. The stories in that book came from letters sent to the magazine 40 in Times, which focused on reports of the odd, mysterious, and unexplained. Since 3 of those letters were sent during the 1970s at different dates, with similar details, plus Rob's recounting, which came decades later with consistent elements, many believed it had to be real. After the mystery spread further and eventually got rolled into some creepypasta stories online, even more accounts appeared on the internet verifying the strange phone message. Of course, it's the internet, so many of these stories were likely fabricated, but some seem to have an air of authenticity. As for what was really happening, one theory suggests that this was actually some kind of test message meant for telephone company repairmen, and someone either stumbled up onto it or leaked it. Over time, it became the stuff of an eerie urban legend. However, there's another layer to this mystery. Why would such a creepy message be used for a test in the first place? Well, according to one theory, the recording didn't actually say, "Help me, Susie's dying." Instead, it said, "Hold please, user dialing." Because of the poor sound quality of the line, it was simply misheard and misinterpreted. Another less widely believed theory holds that it really did say, "Susie's dying," and that it was some part of an emergency response test, possibly related to training first responders or testing communication systems. Whatever the truth, the story of the "Help me, Susie's dying" phone box remains one of the eeriest and most persistent pieces of British telecom folklore. And that brings us to the end of this installment of Part 19 of the Obscure Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg Explained. We are now about halfway through Layer 5. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.